The evening sky was slowly turning blue when Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves arrived at a quiet mountain retreat. They had chosen this place because it was far from noise and far from any pressure. It was a space where the world felt soft, almost like the mountains were guarding every visitor with silence. The cold breeze moved gently around the lodge, and the wooden floor under their feet made a soft sound with every step. Everything in the surroundings promised peace, yet something in the air felt heavier than usual, as if the night wanted to tell its own story. Sandra stopped for a moment near the window, watching the forest trees moving slow and steady. She felt calm, but at the same time, something in her heart felt unsettled without any clear reason. Keanu noticed her expression even before she spoke. He always paid attention to small changes in people, especially in someone he deeply respected. He walked closer and stood beside her with quiet presence, not forcing any conversation. The warm light from the lantern touched the side of their faces, making the room feel safe. They both believed that this night would be peaceful, a simple moment where they could breathe and reset. But right as that thought crossed their minds, a strange sound came from outside the cabin, something sharp and sudden. It echoed against the wooden walls, making Sandra turn her head instantly. The noise was not loud enough to be dangerous, yet it was odd enough to pull both of them out of the comfortable silence. Keanu stepped a little forward, listening carefully. He did not react with fear or confusion. Instead, he kept his body relaxed and steady, showing Sandra that she did not need to panic. But the sound came again. This time it was longer, like something metal was scraping against something hard. Sandra felt her throat tighten. It was a simple noise, but something deep inside her reacted in a way she could not control. She tried to breathe slow, but her chest felt heavy. Memories she did not want to remember tried to push their way back into her mind. She tried to shake them off, but they stayed, making her heart beat faster. Keanu turned toward her and saw the fear growing in her eyes. He took one gentle step closer and said in a soft voice, "Breathe with me." His tone was calm, his eyes steady, and his presence warm, but Sandra could not answer. She tried to nod, but her body did not move. She felt herself freezing, as if something invisible had wrapped around her. She tried again to control her breathing, but every sound outside only made it worse. Her fingers curled around the edge of the couch, her body locked in place. She wanted to speak, to tell him she was fine, but no words came out. The noise outside became stronger, and this time it sounded like something heavy was dragging across the wall of the cabin. Sandra's entire body stiffened. The room felt smaller, the air felt thicker, and her thoughts became tangled. She knew it was probably something simple, maybe just a loose piece of metal being moved by the wind, yet her fear did not listen to logic. She felt her vision blur slightly as her breath turned uneven. Her mind rushed back to a moment she had buried deep inside, a moment she never wanted to relive again. It was just a sound, yet it felt like she was walking back into a memory that had once trapped her in darkness. Keanu's voice reached her again, gentle but firm. "I am right here. You are not alone." His words were simple, but they touched her enough to pull her attention back for a second. He lowered himself slightly so his eyes matched her height. He did not try to touch her yet because he knew sudden contact might make her fear worse. Instead, he gave her space while still letting her know he was close. The way he moved showed respect, and the way he looked at her showed understanding. He did not ask questions. He did not push her to explain. He only stayed steady, becoming something she could rely on in that moment. But the fear had already taken over her body. Sandra felt her hands shaking, her breath uneven and tight. She whispered something, but the sound barely left her lips. Her eyes were stuck on the wall as if the noise outside might break through it. The room felt colder than before, even though the fireplace was still burning softly. Keanu finally understood that she was not just startled. She was trapped in her own mind, pulled back into something painful. He could see it in her eyes, the distant look of someone fighting something invisible but powerful. Sound returned again, sharper this time, and Sandra's body reacted as if she had been hit by a shock. Keanu quickly stepped forward, but gently, making sure not to frighten her more. He placed his hand slowly on her shoulder, letting her feel warmth and support. Her breath caught for a moment, but she did not pull away. She needed something stable to hold on to, something real. Keanu's presence became that anchor. The sound outside kept echoing, but now Keanu's calm voice was louder inside her mind. "Breathe, stay with me, you are safe." It took a moment, but Sandra's eyes finally moved toward him. They were filled with fear, confusion, and something else she could not hide anymore. Keanu nodded slightly, letting her know he understood without her needing to explain. He knew this fear was deeper than the sound outside. He knew something from her past had come back suddenly, something heavy and painful, and he knew she could not fight it alone. Keanu moved closer, slowly wrapping one arm around her back, guiding her gently into the safety of his hold. He did not pull her fast. He did not force her. He simply became a warm and steady presence she could lean on. Sandra did not resist. She allowed herself to be held because she knew Keanu was not trying to fix her. He was trying to protect her. With quiet steps and careful movements, he whispered, "Come with me." It was not a command. It was a soft invitation. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself trust him as he led her toward safety. As they moved, the sound outside echoed one more time, but this time Sandra did not collapse further. She had someone beside her, someone strong but gentle, someone who respected her fear instead of judging it. Keanu held her close, guiding her slowly across the room, making sure every step felt steady. The air still felt heavy, but his presence made it easier. The night outside waited with cold wind and rising mystery. Yet all Sandra could feel at that moment was the warmth of someone who understood her even without words. This was the beginning of a night that would change everything for both of them. The cold night air brushed against Sandra's face as Keanu guided her gently through the small hallway toward the back door of the lodge. Every step felt heavier than the one before. The wooden floor made a soft, creaking sound that echoed inside the quiet cabin. Sandra tried to calm herself, but her heart kept racing as if it wanted to escape her chest. She felt the warmth of Keanu's hand on her arm, and even though her body was still shaking, that warmth grounded her. Keanu moved with calm patience, showing her that they did not need to rush. He stayed close but respectful, giving her enough space to breathe, yet not letting her face the fear alone. The strange metallic noise outside echoed once more. This time it felt closer, sharper, almost like something was dragging across the outer wall again. Sandra flinched, her body tensing instantly. She had no idea why this sound affected her so deeply, but it was as if her mind kept pulling her toward a memory she never wanted to revisit. Keanu stopped walking for a moment and turned slightly toward her. He gently squeezed her hand to remind her she was safe. He whispered, "I am still here. You do not have to be afraid." His voice was soft enough to calm her, yet steady enough to feel protective. They reached the back door and Keanu paused. The night outside was darker than before, and the cold wind pressed against the wooden frame as if it wanted to slip inside. Sandra swallowed slowly, her breath trembling. Keanu noticed and stepped in front of her slightly, shielding her from the view outside. He pushed the door open with his other hand, and a cold rush of air filled the hallway. Sandra took a small step back, but Keanu gently guided her forward. She leaned into him without thinking, relying on his steadiness to keep her centered. Outside, the night was filled with moving shadows. The trees swayed, their branches scratching against each other. The moonlight was faint, hidden behind slow-passing clouds. The air was cold enough to make Sandra's skin prickle. Keanu held her securely, one hand on her shoulder and the other supporting her back. He walked with measured steps, making sure she did not trip or lose balance. Sandra felt slightly embarrassed for needing so much help, but the fear inside her was too strong to ignore. She knew she could not face the unknown sound alone. As they stepped onto the back porch, the noise returned, louder and clearer. Sandra stiffened again, her breathing fast and shallow. Keanu immediately pulled her closer, guiding her head gently toward his shoulder so she would not have to look at anything that frightened her. Sandra closed her eyes and felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. She did not understand why she was reacting so strongly, and that confusion frightened her even more. Keanu whispered, "It is all right. Stay close to me." His words were steady, and the calm tone in his voice helped her breathe a little easier. Keanu moved them slowly down the steps until they reached the small path behind the lodge. The air outside felt different. It carried a tension that neither of them could explain. Sandra tried to speak, but her voice came out thin and broken. Keanu stopped walking and turned to face her fully. He gently placed both hands on her arms, offering warmth and stability. He said, "You do not need to talk right now. Just breathe and stay with me." Sandra nodded weakly, trying to follow his guidance. Her breath began to even out, but the fear inside her did not fade completely. Keanu looked around the area with careful eyes. He did not see anything dangerous, but he knew the sound they heard was not imaginary. He listened closely for a moment. The wind brushed through the trees and distant leaves rustled quietly. Then suddenly the metallic scraping echoed again, this time coming from the side of the cabin. Sandra gasped and tried to step back, but Keanu held her gently and said softly, "I am right here. Do not look, just hold on to me." Sandra closed her eyes again and leaned into him, trusting his guidance fully. Keanu slowly led her toward a small wooden shed behind the lodge. The shed was old but sturdy. Its lantern lights hung loosely above the door, making the area glow faintly. Sandra felt slightly safer moving away from the cabin, but the fear inside her remained strong. Keanu kept his hand on her back, guiding her step by step. He did not rush her. He did not push her. He allowed her to move at a pace her body could handle. Sandra felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she blinked them away, trying not to break down. When they reached the shed, Keanu stopped and let her rest. He did not release her hand. He stayed close, keeping her warm against the cold wind. Sandra took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. She finally whispered, "I am sorry." Her voice was soft and filled with guilt. Keanu shook his head gently and said, "Do not apologize for being human. Fear does not make you weak. It makes you real." Sandra lowered her gaze, trying to process his words. Something inside her settled slightly, as if his voice reached a part of her she had long ignored. Keanu stepped aside just enough to look at the cabin from a distance. From there, he could finally see the loose metal sheet hanging from the roof. The wind pushed it back and forth, causing it to scrape loudly against the wooden wall. The sound was sharp, repetitive, and unsettling. Keanu felt a wave of understanding wash over him. The noise was simple, harmless even, but it was powerful enough to awaken something deep inside Sandra. He looked back at her, watching her slow breaths, and he realized this fear came from something older, something hidden behind her calm exterior. Sandra lifted her head slightly and met his eyes. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of how to explain the storm inside her. Keanu saw the weight she carried, and he knew the night was far from over. He also knew she needed more than comfort. She needed someone who would listen, someone who would understand without judgment. He walked closer and placed a warm hand on her shoulder. He said quietly, "You are safe. Nothing here will hurt you, and I am not leaving your side." Sandra nodded slowly, trusting him more than she trusted her own strength in that moment. The night around them was cold, but Keanu's presence made it feel less threatening. She took one more breath and whispered, "I do not know why I froze." Something about that sound felt too familiar. Her voice trembled, and Keanu noticed immediately. He leaned forward slightly and said, "You do not have to explain right now. You can take your time, but whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone anymore." The moonlight finally broke through the clouds, casting a gentle glow over both of them. Sandra looked at Keanu, feeling the warmth of someone who genuinely cared. She felt the fear inside her shift slightly, making room for something calmer. It was the first moment of peace she felt since the sound began. She did not know how this night would unfold, but she knew one thing clearly. She was no longer facing the darkness alone. And the night was only beginning. The night grew colder, and the wind pushed against the trees with a heavy force. Sandra stood near the small wooden shed, still trying to steady her breathing. Keanu remained beside her without moving away, giving her space while still letting her feel protected. The fear in her chest had softened a little, but it had not disappeared. Something inside her was still shaking, something she could not name yet. Keanu watched her carefully, noticing every small tremble in her hands and every slow breath she took. He knew she was struggling, and he knew she needed time before she could share anything. Sandra leaned lightly against the side of the shed, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt the rough wood behind her back, grounding her just enough to stop her thoughts from racing too fast. Her body was tired, but her mind was more tired. She whispered to herself, trying to understand why the simple sound of metal scraping could pull her into such a strong fear. She felt embarrassed for reacting so intensely, yet her heart kept reminding her that fear does not follow logic. Keanu stepped a little closer, not touching her yet, but close enough for her to feel his presence. He said softly, "Take your time. Your body is remembering something. When you are ready, you can tell me." She opened her eyes slowly and looked at him. The lantern above the shed cast a warm glow on his face, and she could see the patience in his expression. He was not pushing, he was not demanding answers. He was simply waiting with calm understanding. Sandra felt her chest loosen slightly. It had been a long time since someone had offered her this kind of quiet support. She took a slow breath, trying to find the courage to speak. She said quietly, "I do not know where to start." The words felt heavy, but Keanu nodded gently and replied, "You can start anywhere. There is no wrong place. You are safe here." For a moment, Sandra did not speak. She stared at the ground, watching the shadows move with the wind. The scraping noise echoed faintly again from the cabin roof, but this time it did not freeze her completely. She still flinched, her shoulders tightening, but the fear did not take over her body like before. Keanu noticed and stepped closer, placing a soft hand on her arm. The touch was warm, steady, and respectful. Sandra felt her breathing steady with each second his hand remained there. Something about Keanu's calm energy made her feel less alone in the storm inside her. Finally, Sandra whispered, "I think it is connected to something from years ago, something I never spoke about because I thought it was gone." She paused, trying to find the right words. Keanu waited silently, giving her all the space she needed. She continued, I got stuck in an elevator once. It was small and dark and the walls were metal. There was no light for a long time. Every sound echoed so loudly. She swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. I stayed calm at first, but then the walls started making noises like they were moving. That sound today felt exactly the same. Keanu listened closely, every part of him focused on her words. He could see how painful this memory was for her, how heavy and unspoken it had remained. He said softly, that must have been terrifying. Anyone would have felt afraid in that situation. Sandra shook her head lightly, her eyes looking distant. She said, I told myself I moved on. I told myself it was in the past. But today, when I heard that metal sound, it felt like I was back in that elevator again. I could not move. I could not think. It felt real, too real. Keanu stepped a little closer and gently placed both hands on her upper arms, grounding her with his calm energy. He kept his voice soft but steady. He said, trauma does not disappear just because time passes. Sometimes it waits in silence until something touches it again. You are not weak for feeling this. You are human. Sandra looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and relief. She had carried this memory alone for so long, believing it made her less strong. But hearing Keanu speak with such quiet understanding made her feel seen in a way she had not expected. She took another breath and said, I do not know why it hit me so hard today. I never wanted to be a burden. Keanu shook his head gently and answered, you could never be a burden. Fear is not a burden. Sharing it with someone is part of healing. You do not have to carry it alone anymore. His voice held a sincerity that reached her deeply. Sandra felt something shift inside her, as if a heavy lock in her heart had finally opened a little. The wind grew stronger and the metal sheet against the cabin made a loud, sharp sound. Sandra flinched again, but this time Keanu held her firmly, pulling her slightly closer so she felt secure. His arm wrapped around her back with slow, steady pressure. He whispered, look at me, stay with me. Do not let your mind go back there. She focused on his face, on his steady breathing, on the calm in his eyes. Slowly, her heartbeat slowed, her breathing softened, her body relaxed in small steps. The night around them was dark, but the lantern light created a small circle of safety. Sandra whispered, thank you. Her voice cracked slightly, but the gratitude was real. Keanu shook his head gently and said, you do not have to thank me. I am here because you matter. Your fear matters. Your feelings matter. Sandra felt her eyes fill with tears, not from fear this time, but from relief. She wiped them gently, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Keanu helped her sit on a small wooden bench near the shed. He sat beside her, close enough for her to feel supported, but not too close to overwhelm her. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind, the trees, and the soft, distant movement of the cabin roof. Sandra finally whispered, I never talked about that elevator before. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Keanu nodded and said, sometimes silence becomes a mask. But when you finally speak the truth, the fear loses some of its power. Sandra turned her head toward him, her voice soft. Why are you being so kind to me, Keanu? He looked at her gently and replied, because kindness is what we all deserve when we are hurting, and I know what it feels like to be trapped in a memory you cannot escape. Sandra felt his words reach deeper than she expected. There was something in his tone, something heavy and quiet, that made her believe he understood more than he showed. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words stayed in her throat. She sensed that Keanu carried his own painful memories, even if he had not shared them yet. The night around them felt still, as if waiting for what would come next. The fear had not vanished completely, but Sandra felt stronger now. Stronger because someone stood beside her with unwavering patience. Stronger because she was no longer fighting the darkness alone. And the truth she was about to discover would change the way she saw everything. The night around them became heavier as the wind continued to move through the tall mountain trees. Sandra sat quietly on the wooden bench near the shed, her body leaning slightly toward Keanu as if his presence was the only thing keeping her connected to the moment. The cold air brushed against her face, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was still wrapped around the memory she had shared, the memory that had suddenly returned with such force. Keanu sat beside her with calm patience, giving her time to breathe and settle without rushing her into anything more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind and the soft creaking of the loose metal sheet from the cabin roof. Sandra heard it again, and even though her body still tensed, the fear did not take over her completely like before. She looked down at her hands and noticed they were still trembling slightly, but Keanu's steady presence beside her brought a sense of safety she had not felt in years. She whispered, I thought I was past it. I thought I was stronger now. Keanu shook his head softly and said, you are strong. Strength does not mean you never feel fear. Strength means you face it even when it makes your heart shake. His words settled inside her with a warm weight. She took a slow breath and let it out quietly. She wanted to say something more, but before she could, another sharp noise echoed from the cabin. This time it sounded like something had hit the wall harder than before. Sandra's breath caught in her throat, and she leaned closer to Keanu without thinking. Keanu reacted instantly, wrapping his arm around her back again and pulling her gently against him. He whispered, "Do not look. Stay close. You are safe." His voice was steady, almost protective in a way that made her fear soften again. But Keanu's eyes were alert now. He looked toward the cabin with a focused expression. The sound had changed slightly. It was still metal, still scraping, but the impact felt stronger, almost like the wind alone should not be able to move it so violently. He watched the cabin for a moment and listened closely. The wind whistled through the trees and the shadows moved in strange patterns across the ground. He remained calm, but he was also more aware now. Something about the night felt different. Sandra noticed the shift in his posture. She whispered, "What is it?" Keanu did not want to frighten her more, so he kept his voice calm and said, "I am just listening." Sometimes the wind changes direction suddenly at night. It can make the sound sharper. But he continued watching the cabin, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to understand something unseen. Sandra felt her heartbeat rise again, but being in his arms made her feel protected enough to stay grounded. She whispered, "I trust you." The words surprised her, but they were true. Keanu looked at her gently and replied, "I will not let anything happen to you." He helped her stand slowly, keeping one arm around her back. They took a few steps away from the shed so they could see the cabin more clearly. The lantern light behind them cast long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. The wind pushed the trees, making their branches sway like tall, dark figures moving silently in the night. Sandra felt a chill run down her spine, but Keanu's steady hold kept her from slipping back into panic. As they watched the cabin, another sharp impact sounded. Keanu frowned slightly. It was louder than before. Sandra leaned into him and whispered, "That does not sound like just the wind." Keanu nodded quietly, confirming her thought without wanting to alarm her. He said softly, "Stay close to me. I am going to check something." Sandra grabbed his sleeve instantly, fear rising again. She whispered, "Please do not go alone." Keanu paused and met her eyes. He saw the fear and the vulnerability, and he gently placed his hand over hers. "I will not leave you alone," he said quietly. "Come with me. We will look together." His tone was calm, reassuring, and patient. He made sure she understood that she had control, that she could say no if she felt unsafe. Sandra swallowed slowly but nodded. She trusted him enough to follow him even when her fear warned her not to. Keanu kept his arm around her as they walked toward the side of the cabin where the sound had come from. Ground was uneven, and Sandra held tightly onto his arm to keep her balance. The cold air grew sharper as they approached the corner of the cabin. Keanu stopped a few feet away and looked up. From where they stood, they could see the metal sheet hanging loose from the roof. The wind pushed it back and forth, making the loud scraping sound they had heard earlier. But something else was there too. Keanu noticed faint movement near the edge of the roof. He tightened his hold on Sandra slightly and whispered, "Stay with me." They watched carefully. The wind moved again and the loose sheet swung forward. But this time, something behind it shifted, a shadow, small but noticeable. Sandra felt a cold shiver run down her back. She whispered, "What was that?" Keanu kept his eyes focused and stepped slightly in front of her. He said softly, "I am going to get a little closer. Stay behind me." She nodded, her breath shaky but steady enough to follow. Keanu approached the cabin wall slowly, examining the hanging sheet. He reached out with his free hand and steadied it so the wind would not swing it into him. He gently pushed it aside, revealing what was behind it. Sandra stood still, her heart pounding as she waited for his reaction. Keanu's eyes softened slightly, and he let out a quiet breath. He turned to Sandra and said, "Come here, you should see this." Sandra hesitated, fear catching her breath again, but Keanu extended his hand toward her, offering steady guidance. She walked toward him slowly, gripping his hand tightly. When she reached his side, he moved slightly so she could see. Behind the loose metal sheet was a small opening in the wall of the cabin. Inside that opening, curled tightly into a corner, was a tiny, shivering creature. A stray mountain dog, thin, scared, and trembling from the cold. Its fur was rough and its ribs were visible. Its eyes were wide and frightened. Sandra blinked slowly, confusion and compassion mixing instantly in her heart. The dog must have climbed into the gap for warmth. The metal sheet had probably fallen earlier, trapping part of its space and causing the loud noises they had heard. Keanu knelt slowly to avoid frightening the animal even more. He whispered to Sandra the poor thing must have been stuck here for hours. The sound was not danger, it was fear. Sandra's eyes softened as a wave of emotion washed over her. She placed her hand over her mouth as her heart broke for the trembling creature. Keanu reached out gently, offering his hand for the dog to smell. Sandra knelt beside him, her fear replaced with compassion. She whispered, "It was never trying to scare us. It was just trying to survive." Keanu nodded softly. The truth felt heavy yet calming. The mystery noise that had terrified her was the result of a frightened animal struggling against the cold. Sandra reached her hand out slowly, giving the dog time to trust her. After a few moments, the small creature leaned forward and placed its head lightly against her fingers. Sandra felt a soft warmth in her chest that replaced the fear she had carried all evening. Keanu looked at her gently and said, "You see, not every noise is a threat. Sometimes it is a cry for help." Sandra felt tears gather in her eyes again, but this time they came from compassion, not fear. She whispered, "We have to help him." Keanu nodded. He said, "We will, together." He placed one arm around her shoulders, grounding her in the moment. The cold wind moved around them, but for the first time that night, the fear had loosened its grip. Sandra felt stronger, calmer, and more certain. And neither of them knew that this moment was about to open a deeper truth that had been waiting in silence. The small dog trembled in the cold air as Sandra and Keanu knelt beside it. The soft glow from the lantern above them created a gentle circle of light around the three of them, making the moment feel strangely intimate. Sandra touched the thin fur of the frightened animal with slow movements, careful not to startle it. As her fingers brushed its head, something inside her softened. The fear she had been fighting all night seemed to loosen its hold, replaced by a warm sense of compassion. She whispered gently, "You are safe now." Her voice trembled a little, but her eyes held a softness that the dog seemed to recognize. Keanu watched the scene with quiet understanding. He kept one hand resting lightly on Sandra's back, offering steady support without speaking. The dog sniffed Sandra's fingers again and then slowly leaned forward as if surrendering itself to the kindness it felt. Sandra looked up at Keanu, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and relief. She whispered, "He was scared just like I was." Keanu nodded softly and replied, "Fear connects all living things. No one deserves to be alone in it." He reached out and gently lifted the loose metal sheet so he could see the small opening better. The dog's body was thin and its fur was dirty, but there was a spark in its eyes that showed it had not given up. Sandra felt a deep ache in her chest as she realized how long the poor creature might have been trapped there, suffering quietly with no one noticing. She whispered, "He must have been freezing. He must have been hungry." Keanu lowered the metal sheet and looked at her gently. He said, "We can help him. Fear brought him to this place, but kindness can lead him out." Sandra felt her throat tighten with emotion. She did not know why this small creature affected her so deeply, but she knew it touched something inside her that had been hurting for years. Keanu suggested gently, "Let's bring him inside where it is warm. We can give him water and see if the lodge has something he can eat." Sandra nodded quickly, eager to help. She reached out slowly and lifted the dog into her arms. It did not resist. It rested its head against her chest and let out a soft whimper. The sound broke her heart in a way she had not expected. Keanu placed his hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Hold him close. He trusts you already." Sandra nodded again, her eyes growing misty as she held the dog with careful tenderness. They walked back toward the lodge slowly. The wind brushed against their faces, but Sandra barely felt it. She focused entirely on keeping the small dog warm in her arms. Keanu walked beside her, ready to help if she needed it. When they reached the door, he opened it gently so she could step inside without shifting her hold. The warm air of the lodge wrapped around them instantly, bringing a sense of comfort that Sandra deeply needed. She walked to the small sofa near the fireplace and sat down with the dog still pressed against her. Keanu knelt in front of her and took a blanket from the couch. He unfolded it and draped it gently over the dog, tucking it around its trembling body. He whispered, "This will help him warm up." Sandra held the dog close and watched as its shaking slowly started to lessen. She felt her own body relaxing at the same pace. The fire crackled softly in the background, filling the room with gentle warmth. Keanu sat beside her and placed a calm hand on her arm. He said quietly, "You did something beautiful. You helped a life tonight." Sandra looked at him, her eyes soft but filled with unspoken feelings. She whispered, "I did not help alone. I would not have moved without you." Keanu shook his head gently and replied, "You found strength in a moment of fear. That is bravery. It is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to move despite it." Sandra felt a soft breath escape her lips, as if a weight inside her had shifted. She looked down at the small dog, feeling a sense of connection forming not only with the creature, but also with the man sitting beside her. For a moment, silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was full of understanding. Sandra leaned her head slightly toward Keanu, though she did not fully rest it against him. She simply moved close enough to feel the warmth coming from his side. Keanu stayed still, respecting her space while still offering support. The room felt quiet, peaceful, and strangely healing. Then Sandra whispered something so soft that Keanu almost missed it. She said, "I thought fear made me weak. But holding him like this makes me feel something else. It makes me feel alive." Keanu turned his head slightly toward her and replied softly, "Fear does not define you. What you do after fear speaks is what shapes you." Sandra took a slow breath, letting the words sink into her heart. She whispered, "I never told anyone what happened in that elevator. I never told anyone how it changed me." Keanu nodded gently, encouraging her to continue. Sandra looked into the fire and said, "After that day, something inside me stayed scared. I tried to hide it because I did not want anyone to see the parts of me that felt broken." She felt her throat tighten as her voice softened. "I thought if I stayed silent, the memory would fade. But it followed me." Keanu listened with full attention, his expression soft and understanding. He placed his hand gently over her fingers, grounding her again. He said quietly, "Silence can protect us for a while, but it can also trap us in the same memory. Speaking it out is the first step toward freeing yourself." Sandra felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time they were not from fear. They were from release. She whispered, "Maybe I never needed to face it alone. Maybe I was just waiting for the right moment and the right person." She looked at him as she said the last words, her eyes filled with gratitude. Keanu met her gaze with calm gentleness. He whispered, "I am here. You're not alone anymore." Something warm and powerful moved between them, a connection formed not from romance but from deep human understanding. The small dog shifted slightly in Sandra's arms, moving closer to her chest for warmth. She smiled softly and whispered, "He is scared just like I was." Keanu nodded. He said, "And you helped him find safety, just like you are finding it now." The fire continued to fill the room with soft light. Sandra looked at Keanu again, her voice quiet. She asked, "How did you see through me so quickly? How did you know what I needed?" Keanu lowered his eyes for a moment, and Sandra noticed a shadow of emotion pass across his face. When he looked back at her, his voice was softer than before. He said, "Because I know what fear looks like when it hides behind strength." His words made Sandra's breath catch slightly. She leaned forward just a little and whispered, "What do you mean?" Keanu looked at the fire instead of her, his voice low. He said, "I have my own memory too, something I never talk about, something that shaped me in ways I never wanted." Sandra looked at him with new awareness, understanding that he carried a story that had remained locked inside him for a long time. She whispered gently, "You can tell me if you want. You do not have to, but you can." Keanu's breath grew deeper, slower, as if he were preparing himself for something painful. He turned his head toward her again, his eyes filled with quiet vulnerability. He said softly, "There is something I never told anyone." Sandra's heart slowed. She held the dog a little tighter. The room grew even quieter, as if the world wanted to listen to what he was about to reveal. And Keanu's truth was about to open a door she never expected. Fire crackled softly in the quiet lodge, and Sandra waited with a steady but nervous breath. Keanu's voice had shifted. It was softer, lower, almost like the air around them had grown still so it would not interrupt what he was about to say. He looked at the fire for a moment, and the light reflected gently across his face. Sandra could see something in his eyes she had never seen before, a deep and quiet pain that had lived inside him for years. She held the small dog close and whispered, "I am here. Whatever it is, you can tell me." Keanu nodded slowly and took a long breath, grounding himself before speaking. He said quietly, "When I was a kid, there was a storm near our home. I was outside playing, and the wind suddenly grew strong. I tried to run back, but part of the old shed behind the house collapsed. I was trapped inside in the dark. The walls were metal and cold, and I could hear them shifting with the wind." Sandra felt her chest tighten, recognizing the similarity between his fear and hers. Keanu continued, "The storm lasted a long time. I yelled for help, but the sound of the wind covered my voice. I remember feeling like the world had closed around me. Every small noise became louder in the dark, just like the sound you heard tonight." Sandra felt her heart ache. She whispered, "That must have been terrifying." Keanu nodded lightly. "It was. I stayed in there for hours until someone finally found me. I never forgot the feeling of being trapped. Even now, certain sounds bring it back." He looked down at his hands as if the memory had never truly left him. Sandra watched him closely, her eyes gentle and full of understanding. She whispered, "You never told anyone." Keanu shook his head. "I did not want people to think I was weak. I carried it alone because I thought that was what I had to do." Sandra felt a heavy warmth spread through her chest. She reached out slowly and placed her hand over his. Keanu looked up, surprised by the gentle contact. Sandra said softly, "You were a child. Fear does not make you weak, it makes you human." Keanu held her gaze for a moment and something in him softened. He looked relieved, as if finally speaking the truth had released a weight he had carried for too long. He said quietly, "When I saw you freeze tonight, I recognized the look. I knew that feeling. I knew what fear looks like when it comes from a memory you never wanted to relive. And I wanted to be for you what I needed back then." Sandra felt her eyes fill with warm tears, not from sadness but from connection. She whispered, "You protected me without even thinking of yourself." Keanu looked at her gently and replied, "Helping you helped me too. When I pulled you close tonight, it was like I reached back into my own childhood and held that trapped child safe at the same time." His voice trembled slightly, revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed to anyone. Sandra felt her breath catch. She understood him in a way she had never understood anyone before. The small dog shifted again in her arms, pressing closer to her chest for warmth. Sandra looked at it, realizing something important. She whispered, "He was trapped behind the metal just like you were, just like I was." Keanu nodded softly. Fear connected all three of them in one strange, unexpected moment. The dog trembled, but now it trembled in a warm room, wrapped in a blanket, safe in Sandra's arms. Sandra felt her own heart reflecting that same journey, from fear to calm, from trembling to trust. Keanu stood slowly and walked toward the small kitchen area of the lodge. He returned with a bowl of warm water and placed it gently on the floor. The dog lifted its head and looked at the bowl with tired eyes. Sandra placed the dog down carefully, and it walked toward the bowl with small, shaky steps. Watching the tiny creature drink made Sandra feel a wave of relief, as if the act of helping it healed something inside her too. Keanu stood beside her, and together they watched the dog regain small pieces of its strength. Sandra turned toward Keanu and whispered, "I believe he found us for a reason." Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly, listening. She continued, "Maybe tonight was meant to show us something. Maybe the fear we carried alone was never supposed to stay hidden. Maybe this was life's way of telling us that healing begins when someone stands beside you." Keanu looked at her with soft eyes and said, "Maybe you are right. Sometimes the universe brings the right souls together at the exact moment they need each other." They moved back to the sofa and sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. But the silence was different now. It was warm, comforting, full of understanding. Sandra whispered, "I felt so small tonight. I felt like I lost control. But then you held me, and suddenly I was not afraid of the darkness anymore." Keanu turned to her and said softly, "Darkness loses its power when someone walks into it with you. You did that for me too, even if you did not see it." Sandra felt a gentle warmth spread through her, as she realized the truth in his words. She leaned her head lightly on Keanu's shoulder, not out of fear this time, but out of trust. Keanu did not move away. He simply let her rest, respecting her need for closeness while offering the calm presence she had found strength in all night. The firelight danced across the room, and the small dog curled up near their feet, finally resting peacefully. Sandra whispered, "I feel like I can breathe again." Keanu nodded gently, "You are safe now. And whatever fear returns in the future, you do not have to face it alone." The flames in the fireplace softened, creating a warm orange glow that filled the room with a peaceful mood. Sandra lifted her head and whispered, "Thank you, Keanu, for everything." Keanu shook his head slightly. "No, thank you. Supporting you made me face a part of myself I had hidden for many years. It reminded me that vulnerability is not something to fear. It is something that connects people in the strongest way." Sandra smiled softly, feeling tears again, but this time they carried gratitude instead of fear. Keanu stood and walked toward the small window near the door. The wind had calmed. The loose metal sheet no longer scraped against the cabin wall. The storm had passed outside just as the storm had passed inside their hearts. He turned back to Sandra and said softly, "The night is calm now." Sandra stood and walked toward him, gently placing her hand on his arm. She whispered, "The night changed everything. We came here for peace, but what we found was understanding." Keanu nodded quietly. "Yes. Understanding and healing." They looked down at the small dog resting peacefully near the sofa. Sandra whispered, "We cannot leave him outside. He needs us." Keanu smiled softly and replied, "Then he stays with us. Tonight he joins our little circle of survivors." Sandra laughed softly, her heart finally light again. Keanu's smile softened as he watched her, grateful for the warmth returning to her face. The night had begun with fear, but it ended with three souls sitting in the glow of a gentle fire. One wounded dog, one woman reliving a buried memory, one man carrying a quiet childhood pain, all brought together by a moment of fear that turned into a moment of healing. Sandra whispered the final truth of the night, a truth that lived in her heart now. She said, "We saved each other." Keanu looked at her with warm eyes and replied, "Yes, we did." And for the first time in a long time, both of them felt whole.